Welcome to the deep dive. Today, we're tackling something pretty fundamental, really, to how we understand the past
Mhm.
perspective.
Mhm.
History isn't just a list of dates and facts. It's more like an ongoing interpretation, a sort of dialogue between what happened back then and how we see it
Oh,
now.
absolutely. And our own viewpoint, where we're standing, it inevitably shapes that conversation, doesn't it?
It really
And
does.
we've got some fascinating source material today that really gets into this. It raises some core questions people often ask, like
Yeah.
how do we figure out what actually happened?
Right. And how much does a historian's own background, their own life, influence how they tell a story?
Exactly. And why can it feel so hard sometimes to really, truly grasp the viewpoints of people from, well, completely different times or places?
Yeah, exactly. Our sources today, they get into all of that. Like, how do we weigh proof when historical accounts just don't line up?
Hmm.
Is it even possible for historians to be completely objective? What about empathy? How important is that?
And the benefits, too. How having different viewpoints actually helps build a better picture rather than just muddying the waters.
Yeah, definitely. We'll also touch on bias. Is it just unavoidable? And the massive impact of cultural context.
And how we can maybe spot those cultural or national angles in historical accounts.
Right. And even the sneaky ways our own brains work, cognitive biases, how they might color how we look back at history.
So the goal today is really to navigate all these, let's say, complexities.
And understand how looking at things from different angles actually leads to a richer, maybe even a more accurate understanding of the past.
Okay, let's get into it.
Let's unpack this. Where should we start? Maybe with that basic question about proof.
Yeah, that's a good place. So if establishing absolute proof in history is often tricky, does that mean, any version of events is just as good as any other?
It's a fair question.
But our sources give some pretty compelling examples that suggest, well, no, not really.
Like the Titanic example.
Exactly. For years after the sinking, you had survivors giving completely different stories about whether the ship broke in two before it went under.
Right. Some were adamant it did, others totally denied it.
Total disagreement
Yeah.
based on what they saw or thought they saw in that chaos.
Hmm.
But then when Ballard found the wreck in 85,
Right. And they mapped the debris field.
precisely, that gave definitive physical evidence the ship had broken apart. So while those initial accounts differed,
The evidence settled it. It showed some accounts were just inaccurate.
exactly. Concrete evidence can act as that crucial arbiter. It shows firsthand accounts, even can be flawed or incomplete.
Memory under duress, too, I suppose.
For sure. And we see something, well, maybe even more disturbing with the Tulsa race massacre in 1921.
Yeah. That's a tough one.
For decades, the dominant story, especially in like local newspapers and official accounts, basically blamed the black residents of Greenwood for the violence.
Which is just horrific, knowing what we know now.
It's appalling. But that narrative held sway for a long, long time.
So how did that change? What evidence came to light?
Well, as our sources point out, there's been ongoing archaeological work digging at the sites.
Okay.
And crucially, insurance records and other documents became accessible, especially between, say, 2020 and 2023.
New primary sources.
Yes. And this wave of new evidence flatly contradicts that old blame the victim narrative. It strongly supports the scholarship showing a very different picture of who was responsible for the massacre.
So the takeaway isn't just that stories differ.
No, it's that the existence of different stories doesn't make them equally valid. You have to weigh them against the evidence.
The weight and the convergence of reliable evidence matter.
Absolutely. So
Yeah.
evidence is powerful. But it still raises that question about the historian, doesn't it? Can they ever be truly objective?
Yeah, that's the big one. Are historians' accounts inevitably subjective to some degree?
It's central to historiography, the study of how history gets written.
Right.
And our sources give some interesting contrasts. Think about E.P. Thompson and Lawrence Stone, both studying English history. Thompson, coming from a Marxist angle, really focused on the working class, their actions, their agency.
Right. History from below.
Kind of, yeah.
Yeah.
Whereas Stone used more of an anthropological lens, looking at things like family structures, demographic changes over the long term.
So same broad topic, different focus, different questions.
Exactly. Their theoretical perspectives shaped what they looked for and what they emphasized.
But were they just imposing their views?
Well, the crucial point our source makes is that both Thompson and Stone were very open about their perspectives. They declare their frameworks.
Transparency.
Yes. And they both relied heavily on rigorous archival research to back up their arguments. It wasn't just opinion.
Okay, so they showed their work, essentially.
You could say that.
Okay.
And look at Mary Beard's work on Rome, like SPQR.
Very popular.
She explicitly states she's interested in the nobodies, the ordinary people,
Yeah.
often informed by her feminist perspective. But again, the book is packed with references to primary sources, inscriptions, coins, archaeology.
So it seems the key isn't lacking a perspective, because maybe that's impossible,
Perhaps.
but being upfront about it and making sure your interpretation is still grounded in solid evidence.
Precisely. Acknowledged perspectives combined with rigorous methods and transparency, those are the safeguards against just, unchecked subjectivity. It's about responsible interpretation.
Okay, so we've got evidence and we've got the historian's viewpoint. What about understanding the people in the past, their experiences? How crucial is empathy?
That's a fascinating question. Our sources suggest empathy might play a bigger role in history than in, say, the hard sciences.
Why would that be?
Well, think about the Yad Vashem project in Israel, digitizing Holocaust diaries.
Okay.
The people translated these incredibly painful personal accounts, often add footnotes, not just translating words, but explaining the context, the nuances, trying to help us understand the emotional world the writer was living in.
Trying to bridge that gap in experience.
Exactly. It requires a kind of imaginative leap and empathy that you might not need if you're, writing up physics experiment results.
Right. In physics, the feelings don't change the laws of nature. But with human history.
It's a different ballgame, isn't it? Our sources also bring up the COVID-19 oral history projects happening now.
Capturing experiences of the pandemic.
Yeah. Interviewers talking to frontline workers, people who lost loved ones, they need empathy to build trust, to get those rich, detailed accounts.
But they also need to be objective.
Well, they need critical distance. It's a balance. You need empathy to understand, but also that distance to ensure the historical record is accurate and, not just swayed by emotion.
That sounds like a really difficult tightrope to walk.
It is. And the key point highlighted in the material is how empathy can help counter presentism.
Judging the past by today's standards.
Exactly. It helps us try to understand why people acted as they did within their own context, especially when they can't speak for themselves anymore. Empathy adds that human dimension.
That makes a lot of sense. Okay, stepping back a bit. What about the bigger picture? How does having multiple perspectives actually benefit historical knowledge overall?
This is where it gets really interesting. It seems counterintuitive sometimes, like more views just mean more confusion.
Right, like too many cooks.
But actually, our sources show it leads to a richer understanding. Think about the centenary of World War I, around 2014.
Okay.
For ages, especially in Britain and France, the dominant story heavily emphasized German guilt as the main cause. The war guilt clause in the Versailles Treaty and all that.
Sure, that was the standard narrative for a long time.
But then you had historians like Christopher Clark with his book Sleepwalkers.
Right, that made a big splash.
It did, because he took a much broader view, emphasizing the sort of collective stumbling into war, the miscalculations and blunders by all the major powers.
So it wasn't just pointing fingers at Germany.
No.
Yeah.
It presented a much more complex picture of shared responsibility almost. And interestingly, Clark's work actually spurred historians in places like Serbia and Russia to dig back into their archives.
Oh, really? What did they find?
New documents, diplomatic telegrams, things that added even more nuance to how the July crisis unfolded. So that different perspective didn't just offer a new interpretation, it led to new evidence being uncovered.
Wow. So challenging the old view actually expanded the knowledge base.
Exactly. And another great example from our sources is the research on the Silk Roads.
Okay.
You've had recent collaborations bringing together historians from China, from Persia, from Europe, and they're using modern tools like satellite imagery.
What are they finding with satellites?
They've been able to map out these vast networks of caravanserai, those old roadside inns for travelers and traders.
Right.
Networks that were largely invisible or ignored in older, more Eurocentric histories that just focused on the endpoints of trade.
So bringing in those other perspectives literally revealed structures on the ground that were missed.
Precisely. It's like finding missing pieces of the puzzle, pieces you didn't even know were missing because you were only looking at one part of the picture.
That's a powerful illustration.
It really is. Different viewpoints, different expertise, they expose the blind spots in existing narratives. And it's through synthesizing these multiple perspectives that we get a much fuller, more nuanced understanding than any single viewpoint could ever offer.
So, embracing diversity of perspective isn't just about fairness, it's actually crucial for advancing historical knowledge itself.
Absolutely fundamental.
Okay, but if we're embracing all these perspectives, that brings us back to bias, doesn't it? Can historians ever really be free of bias when they choose what sources to look at or how they interpret them?
That's the million-dollar question, isn't it?
Yeah.
Our sources suggest that, well, complete freedom from bias is probably an unattainable ideal.
Right, we all have backgrounds, assumptions.
Exactly. But that doesn't mean we just throw up our hands. It's about managing it. Think about the history workshop movement that started in the UK back in the 60s and 70s.
Okay, what was their approach?
They made a very conscious effort to focus on the lives of ordinary people, factory workers, women, people involved in social movements, precisely because they felt traditional history was too focused on kings and queens and prime ministers.
So they were trying to correct an elite bias.
Yes, absolutely. They wanted to tell different kinds of stories, bring marginalized voices into the picture.
But did that introduce its own bias?
Well, our source does note that, inevitably, this led to a strong focus on certain themes like labor history, social conflict, politics from below. So yes, in correcting one bias, they arguably introduced a different emphasis, a different kind of selection.
So bias shifts, maybe, but doesn't disappear.
That seems to be the idea. We even see attempts to grapple with this in the digital world now, like on Wikipedia.
How so?
You know how sometimes articles become battlegrounds, edit wars?
Oh, yeah.
Well, they now use automated bots that can flag articles if, say, the sources cited are overwhelmingly from one country or one political viewpoint.
Trying to algorithmically nudge towards balance.
Kind of. It's an attempt to reduce that selection bias, but of course it can't eliminate it entirely. It's a mitigation tool.
So the takeaway is that bias is inherent, almost.
It seems that way, but the goal isn't necessarily impossible purity. It's about awareness, about conscious effort, and using methodological tools to try and keep that bias in check, to strive for balance.
Okay, that makes sense. It's about acknowledging it and working with it.
Right. Which connects nicely to the next point.
Yeah.
The influence of the historian's own cultural context. Is it just inevitable that they'll be affected by the time and place they live in?
It seems hard to imagine otherwise. How does our present reality shape how we view the past?
Our sources give some really stark examples. Think about the Cold War again.
Okay.
After the Soviet Union collapsed in 1991, the archives started opening up. Suddenly, Western historians had access to vast amounts of information they never had before.
Right, from the other side.
Exactly. And it forced a major revision of how the Cold War was understood in the West. Narratives that had been built during the Cold War itself, based on limited intelligence, maybe some propaganda, suddenly looked like products of their time.
So the earlier histories were shaped by the geopolitical context they were written in.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
You can almost read them now, not just as history, but as documents reflecting that specific Cold War moment.
It's like history is constantly being rewritten as the present changes.
In many ways, yes. And we see it politically, too. Take Kenya, after its new constitution in 2010.
What happened there?
The constitution included a mandate to incorporate the perspectives of the Mao Mao fighters into the national history curriculum taught in schools.
Ah, the anti-colonial fighters.
Yes, this was a very deliberate political move to reshape the national identity, emphasizing resistance against colonialism, reflecting a shift in contemporary Kenyan politics, and how the nation wanted to see its origins.
So what gets taught as history is often a direct reflection of current values or political goals.
Very often. The school curriculum becomes a sort of mirror reflecting the present, using the past. It shows how deeply intertwined historical narratives are with the cultural and political landscape of the present day.
That's a really powerful point. History isn't just back there, it's actively shaped by right here, right now.
Exactly.
So, okay, if cultural and national contexts are so influential, how can we as readers of histories start to gauge that? How do we figure out the extent to which a story is being told from a particular cultural or national perspective?
That's a great question. Are there telltale signs? Our sources suggest a few ways to approach this.
Like what?
One method is comparative studies, especially of things like textbooks.
Comparing how different countries teach the same event.
Precisely. For instance, researchers looked at how textbooks in the EU and Japan cover the atomic bombing of Hiroshima.
What did they find?
They actually counted the frequency of specific words. They found Japanese textbooks use the term atom bomb far more often than terms relating to surrender. While in French textbooks, for example, that ratio was reversed. More emphasis on surrender. It suggests different underlying moral framings, different national narratives about the event's significance and cause.
Wow, that's fascinating. Just counting words can reveal a different emphasis, a different perspective.
It's a quantitative way to get at the underlying narrative. And we see similar things happening now with digital tools.
Like analyzing social media.
Yeah, digital discourse analysis. Our source mentions looking at Twitter hashtags during the Russian invasion of Ukraine in 2022.
What did they track?
They looked at the usage and clustering of hashtags like the Russian hashtag everything according to plan versus things like hashtag stand with Ukraine.
Mapping out the competing narratives in real time.
Exactly.
Yeah.
It provided this linguistic snapshot of the opposing nationalist framings of the conflict as it was unfolding. The language used clearly delineated these different perspectives.
So, whether it's textbooks or tweets, paying close attention to the language, the word choices, the framing can give us clues about the underlying cultural or national viewpoint.
That's right. These linguistic and sometimes quantitative methods can help reveal those perspectives, even when they're not explicitly stated by the author.
Okay, final area then. What about our own minds? Cognitive biases. Are we more prone to certain thinking traps, like hindsight bias, when we study history compared to other fields?
That's another really interesting angle. Our sources suggest, yes, certain biases might be especially tricky in history. Hindsight bias is a big one.
That's the I knew it all along effect, right?
Exactly. After something happens, it seems inevitable in retrospect. Think about intelligence failures, like the investigations after 9/11.
Okay.
Analysts looking back could often piece together warning signs that seemed obvious after the fact. But were they obvious before the event, amidst all the noise and uncertainty? Probably not.
It's easy to connect the dots looking backwards.
Much easier. In fields like political science history, they sometimes use techniques like red teaming, basically having a separate team argue against the known outcome to try and recapture that sense of uncertainty.
Trying to fight that hindsight bias. Is it different in science?
Well, perhaps in experimental science, the outcome is genuinely unknown before the experiment runs. There's less room for hindsight bias in the design phase itself, maybe.
Makes sense. Any other examples in history?
Economic history is another area. Looking back at the 2008 financial crisis now, the housing bubble seems like it was screamingly obvious, a disaster waiting to happen.
It does seem that way now, yeah.
But if you actually read the minutes from the Federal Reserve meetings before the crash, you see real debate, genuine uncertainty, policymakers grappling with conflicting data. It wasn't clear-cut to them at the time.
So recognizing this tendency towards hindsight bias is important for historians.
Crucial. It allows them to develop correctives, like consciously using counterfactuals, asking, what if X hadn't happened? Or paying super close attention to the dates on documents to avoid reading later knowledge back into earlier decisions.
It's about trying to understand the past on its own terms with the knowledge available then.
Exactly. Being aware of these potential cognitive traps helps historians be more rigorous and avoid presenting the past as simpler or more predictable than it really felt to the people living through it.
Wow. Okay. This has been, well, a real deep dive, hasn't it, into perspective in history.
It really has.
We've covered a lot. How establishing proof is complex, but evidence still matters hugely.
And how subjectivity isn't necessarily a fatal flaw if it's handled with transparency and rigor.
Right. And the absolute importance of empathy for understanding human experiences in the past.
And the huge benefits of bringing diverse viewpoints together, how it actually strengthens our knowledge.
Plus tackling bias, the influence of culture, how to spot different perspectives.
And even those cognitive biases, like hindsight, that we need to watch out for.
So what's the big takeaway here? Is it that there's no single true history?
I think the core insight is that historical knowledge isn't about finding one static, objective truth carved in stone. It's much more dynamic. It's about understanding the past through many different lenses.
And having those different perspectives, even if they clash sometimes.
Is ultimately a good thing. It's what pushes our understanding forward, makes it richer, more complete, more nuanced.
So the process is about being aware of our own viewpoint, critically looking at evidence, and really engaging with those different interpretations. That's how we get to a better understanding.
Absolutely.
Which leaves us with a final thought, maybe something for you, the listener, to mull over.
Yeah, here's something to consider. Think about a historical event or period you feel you know pretty well.
Okay.
Now, actively try to imagine looking at it from a completely different perspective. Maybe someone from a different social class than the usual figures, or a different nationality, or even someone looking back from a much later time period.
How would shifting your viewpoint like that change your understanding? What new questions might pop up?
It's a really powerful exercise, actually. A great way to deepen how you engage with the past.